The barn smelled like old hay and shame. Gideon Cross stood at the back of the crowd, hat pulled low, watching something he never thought he'd see again. Not here, not 4 years after the war had supposedly ended all of this. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice like gravel scraping iron, stood on a wooden crate under the oil lamps, gesturing toward a girl who couldn't have been more than 13. She stood on the platform in a dress 2 sizes too big, sleeves torn at the shoulders, her bare feet dusty and calloused. Her wrists were bound in front of her with frayed rope, and her hair hung in dark tangles over her face. She didn't look at the men gathered below. She looked at the floor, at the straw, at anything but the eyes that studied her like livestock. 13 years old, the auctioneer called out, strong enough to work, quiet, no family to come looking, no husband to complain, starting bid $20. A few men chuckled, one spat tobacco into the dirt. Gideon felt his jaw tighten. The girl shifted her weight, and the rope around her wrists pulled taut. She winced but didn't cry out. Instead, she whispered something so quiet that only the men closest to the platform could hear. Please don't look there. Not a cry for help, a plea for mercy. Gideon's chest tightened. He'd heard those words before, years ago, in another barn, in another county, under another name. He'd been younger then, too young to do anything, too afraid to speak. He'd watched a woman beg the same way, and he'd done nothing. He'd walked out of that barn and told himself it wasn't his business. He'd been lying to himself ever since. The auctioneer grinned, teeth stained yellow. Come on now, gentlemen, she's got years of work in her. Someone's got to take her off our hands. A man near the front raised his hand. 15. Another voice from the side. 18. The girl's breathing quickened. Her fingers curled into fists, the rope cutting into her skin. Gideon felt the weight of his colt under his coat, felt the heat rising in his chest. He'd come here to buy a horse, that's all. A good mare, maybe a gelding. He'd told himself he wouldn't get involved in anything else. He'd promised himself he'd keep his head down, stay quiet, stay out of trouble. But then the girl looked up. Just for a second. Her eyes swept across the crowd, and for a heartbeat, they landed on him. Dark eyes, hollow, afraid. And something else. Recognition. Gideon's breath caught. She didn't know him, he was sure of that. But there was something in her face, something in the shape of her jaw, the curve of her brow, that hit him like a fist to the gut. He knew her. Not her name, not her voice, but her face. 8 years ago, he'd ridden through a settlement near the Arkansas border. A family had taken him in for the night, offered him supper, a place to sleep in their barn. The father had been kind, the mother quiet, and there'd been a little girl, maybe 5 years old, who'd peeked at him from behind the doorframe, clutching a rag doll. She'd had a scar on her left cheek, small, crescent-shaped. This girl had the same scar. Gideon's heart slammed against his ribs. The auctioneer's voice cut through the fog in his head. $20, do I hear 20? Silence. The girl's shoulders sagged. Gideon's hand moved before his brain caught up. He raised it high, voice cutting through the barn like a knife. 50. Every head turned. The auctioneer blinked. 50. $50, Gideon repeated louder this time. Cash. The crowd murmured. A few men stepped aside, eyes narrowing at him. The auctioneer's grin widened. Well now, 50 it is, anyone else? No one spoke. The auctioneer slammed his hand on the crate. Sold, to the gentleman in the back. Gideon didn't move. He watched as one of the hired hands untied the girl's wrists and shoved her toward the edge of the platform. She stumbled, caught herself, and looked back at the crowd one last time. Her eyes found Gideon again. This time there was no recognition, only fear. He pulled the bills from his coat pocket, walked to the front, and handed them to the auctioneer without a word. The man counted them twice, nodded, and waved toward the girl. She's yours, no refunds. Gideon didn't answer. He turned to the girl, gestured toward the barn door. Come on. She didn't move. I said, come on. Her voice was barely a whisper. Where? Away from here. She glanced at the men around them, at the ropes still coiled on the platform, at the auctioneer lighting a cigar. Then she looked back at Gideon. Why? He didn't have an answer, not one that made sense, not one that wouldn't sound like a lie. So he just said, because I should have done this a long time ago. Her eyes flickered with something, confusion maybe, or suspicion. But she followed him. They walked out of the barn together, into the cool night air, the sound of hoofbeats and low voices fading behind them. Gideon's horse, a grey gelding named Ash, St. Ood tied to the post outside. He untied the reins, glanced at the girl. You ride? She nodded. Good, get on. She hesitated, then climbed up into the saddle, her movements stiff and careful. Gideon swung up behind her, took the reins, and kicked Ash into a steady walk. They rode in silence for a long time. The moon hung low over the hills, casting long shadows across the dirt road. The air smelled like sage and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The girl spoke first. You're not gonna. She didn't finish. Gideon's voice was quiet. No. Then why'd you buy me? I didn't buy you. Yes, you did. I paid money, that's not the same thing. She turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see the edge of her face in the moonlight. Everybody says that after. Gideon didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. She was right. He had paid money. He had walked into that barn, raised his hand, and taken her like property. It didn't matter what he told himself. It didn't matter what he intended. The world saw it the same way. After a while, the girl spoke again. What's your name? Gideon. Where are we going? My place, it's not far. And then, I don't know. She didn't ask anything else. They rode on through the dark, the sound of Ash's hooves steady and rhythmic, the night stretching out around them like a long, unbroken sigh. Gideon kept his eyes on the road ahead. But in his mind, all he could see was that little girl from 8 years ago, peeking out from behind the doorframe. And the burning farmhouse he'd ridden past 3 days later. Gideon's ranch sat at the edge of a valley where the cottonwoods grew thick and the creek ran year-round. It wasn't much, a small house with a stone chimney, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and a corral that held 2 horses and a mule. But it was his. He'd built it with his own hands after the war, after he'd decided he was done running. He tied Ash to the post outside the house, dismounted, and offered the girl his hand. She didn't take it. She slid down on her own, landing hard on the ground, then stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the house like it might swallow her whole. Gideon gestured toward the door. You can sleep inside. There's a room in the back. It's small, but it's clean. She didn't move. You hungry? No answer. He sighed, rubbed the back of his neck. Look, I'm not good at this. I don't know what to say to make you believe me, but you're safe here. I'm not gonna hurt you. She looked at him then, really looked at him. Her eyes were sharp, searching, like she was trying to read something written on his face. Why'd you really buy me? Gideon opened his mouth, closed it. How could he explain it? How could he tell her that he'd seen her face and remembered a little girl from 8 years ago, that he'd ridden past a burning farmhouse and done nothing, that he'd carried that guilt ever since, like a stone in his chest? He couldn't. So he told her the only truth he could manage. Because I knew your family. The words hung in the air between them. The girl's expression didn't change, but her breathing did, shallow, fast. No, you didn't. I did long time ago. You were just a kid. You're lying. I'm not. Her voice rose, cracking at the edges. You don't know anything about me. I know your name's not whatever they called you in that barn, Gideon said quietly. I know you had a father who built furniture, a mother who sang hymns, and I know they're gone." The girl went still. Gideon swallowed hard. "I stopped at your family's place once, 8 years back. Your pa let me sleep in the barn. Your ma gave me cornbread. You hid behind the door the whole time, wouldn't say a word." Her hands trembled. "You had a doll," Gideon continued. "Rag doll, missing one eye." The girl's breath hitched. "I rode out the next morning. 3 days later, I came back through that way. The house was burned to the ground. Everything gone." I asked around. Nobody knew what happened, or nobody wanted to say. She was shaking now, not from cold, from something deeper. "I didn't stop," Gideon said, his voice rough. "I should have, but I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I couldn't have done anything anyway." He looked at her, and for the first time, he let her see the weight he'd been carrying. "I've thought about that every day since." The girl's face twisted. Anger, grief, something in between. "You think that makes it better?" she whispered. "You think saying you feel bad changes anything?" "No." "Then why tell me?" "Because you deserve to know." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned away, her shoulders shaking. "They came at night," she said, her voice barely audible. "Men with torches. They said my father owed money. They said he'd cheated someone. They dragged him out of the house and beat him in the yard while my mother screamed." Gideon's chest tightened. "They set the house on fire. My mother ran back inside to get something, I don't know what. She never came out. My father tried to go after her, but they held him down, made him watch." Her voice cracked. "Then they shot him." Gideon closed his eyes. "I hid in the root cellar," the girl continued. "I stayed there for 2 days. When I came out, everything was ash. I walked until I found a road. Then I just kept walking." She turned back to face him, tears streaking through the dust on her cheeks. "I don't even remember my name anymore. People called me so many things. After a while, I stopped answering to any of them." Gideon's throat felt thick. "Your name's Clara," he said softly. The girl, Clara, looked at him like he'd struck her. "How do you know that?" "Your mother said it when she called you to supper." Clara's face crumpled. She sank to her knees in the dirt, her hands pressed over her mouth, and she sobbed. Gideon knelt beside her. He didn't touch her. He just stayed there, close enough that she wasn't alone. After a long time, she spoke again, her voice hoarse. "You should have stopped. I know. You should have done something. I know." She looked at him, her eyes red and raw. "Why didn't you?" Gideon didn't have an answer, not a good one, so he told her the truth. "Because I was afraid." Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Yeah," she whispered, "me too." They sat there in the dirt for a while, the stars burning overhead, the wind moving through the cottonwoods. Finally, Clara stood. She looked at the house, then back at Gideon. "If I stay here," she said slowly, "you don't own me." "I never did. And I can leave whenever I want." "You can." She studied him for a long moment, then she nodded. "Okay." Gideon rose to his feet, brushed the dust from his knees. "Come on," he said, "I'll get you some food." They walked toward the house together, the night settling around them like a heavy blanket. Behind them, ash nickered softly. And somewhere in the distance, hoofbeats echoed through the valley. The riders came at dawn. Gideon heard them before he saw them, 3 horses moving fast, kicking up dust along the creek road. He set down the axe he'd been using to split firewood and walked to the edge of the porch, one hand resting on the colt at his hip. Clara stood in the doorway behind him, her face pale. "Who is it?" she whispered. "Don't know yet." But he had a feeling. The riders slowed as they approached, fanning out into a loose line. The man in the center was tall, broad-shouldered, with a badge pinned to his vest. His face was weathered, his eyes cold. "Sheriff Dalton." Gideon's jaw tightened. Dalton reined his horse to a stop 10 feet from the porch. The two men flanking him, hired guns, by the look of them, stayed mounted, hands resting near their sidearms. "Morning, Cross," Dalton said, his voice smooth as oil. "Sheriff." Dalton's gaze drifted past Gideon, landing on Clara, his mouth curved into a thin smile. "Heard you made a purchase last night." Gideon didn't answer. $50, Dalton continued. "That's a lot of money for a girl who can't even cook." "She's not for sale." "Didn't say she was, just making conversation." Dalton dismounted, looped his reins over the post, and stepped closer. His boots crunched on the gravel. "Thing is," he said, "I got a report this morning. Seems there's some folks who think that auction last night wasn't exactly legal." Gideon's eyes narrowed. "You were there." "Sure was, but I wasn't the one running it." "You didn't stop it either." Dalton shrugged. "Not my job to police every barn sale in the county, but now that someone's raised a fuss, I gotta look into it, make sure everything's above board." He glanced at Clara again. "So I'm here to take her back." Gideon's hand tightened on the Colt. "No." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "No. She's staying here." "That's not how this works, Cross. If the auction was illegal, then the sale's void, which means she goes back to whoever had her before." "She's not going back." Dalton's smile faded. "You really want to do this?" "Yeah, I do." For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Then Dalton sighed, shook his head. "You always were stubborn, even back during the war." Gideon's pulse quickened. Dalton took another step forward. "You remember the Cartwright farm," he said quietly, "out near the Arkansas line." Gideon's blood ran cold. "I remember," Dalton continued, "because I was the one who led the soldiers there. We'd gotten word that the Cartwrights were hiding Confederate deserters, traitors to the Union cause, so we burned them out." He paused, his eyes locking onto Gideon's. "Turned out the information was bad. No deserters, just a man, his wife, and a little girl." Clara made a small sound behind Gideon, half gasp, half sob. Dalton's smile returned. "But by then it was too late. House was already burning, so we left, called it war." Gideon's vision narrowed. His hand moved toward his Colt. Dalton's men shifted in their saddles, hands dropping to their guns. "Easy now," Dalton said, raising a hand. "I'm just here to do my job. You hand over the girl and we all walk away. No trouble." Gideon's voice was low, dangerous. "You killed her family." "I followed orders." "You burned them alive." Dalton's expression hardened. "I did what I had to do, just like you're gonna do what you have to do now." He stepped back, gestured toward Clara. "Bring her out." Gideon drew his Colt. The two hired guns pulled their weapons. Dalton didn't flinch. "You really want to die for her?" he asked. "If that's what it takes." Clara's voice cut through the tension. "Stop." Gideon glanced back. She stood in the doorway, her face pale but steady. "I'll go," she said. "No," Gideon said. "It's not worth dying for." "Yes, it is." She looked at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't name. "You already tried to save me once," she said quietly. "You don't get to die doing it." Gideon's throat tightened. Before he could respond, a voice called out from the road. "Sheriff." Everyone turned. A group of men on horseback crested the hill, ranch hands, by the look of them. Older men, weathered and hard. Gideon recognized a few faces, men he'd worked cattle with over the years, men who'd shared whiskey and stories around campfires. The lead rider, a gray-haired man named Hank, rode forward and stopped beside Dalton's horse. "Heard there was trouble out here," Hank said. Dalton's jaw tightened. "This is official business." "Didn't look official," Hank replied. "Looked like three men with guns pointed at a man and a girl." The other riders fanned out, surrounding Dalton's men. Dalton's eyes flickered with anger. "You got no right." "We got every right," Hank interrupted. "We've been watching you, Dalton. We know what you did during the war, and we know what you've been doing since." He gestured toward Clara. "She stays here with Gideon." Dalton's hand hovered near his gun. But he was outnumbered. After a long moment, he lowered his hand, mounted his horse, and looked down at Gideon. "This ain't over." "Yeah," Gideon said, "it is." Dalton spurred his horse and rode off, his men following. The ranch hands stayed until the riders disappeared over the hill. Then Hank tipped his hat to Gideon. "You take care, Gid." "Thanks, Hank." The men rode off, leaving Gideon and Clara alone. She looked at him, her eyes still wide. "What just happened?" Gideon holstered his Colt. "Justice," he said, "maybe." The days that followed were quiet. Clara stayed in the back room. She didn't say much, didn't ask for much. She moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to touch anything, careful not to take up space. Gideon gave her room. He worked outside, mending fences, tending to the horses, chopping wood. He didn't push her to talk, didn't ask her to do anything. He just let her be. On the third day, she came outside. Gideon was working on the corral fence, hammering a new post into place. He glanced up, saw her standing near the porch, arms wrapped around herself. "You need something?" he asked. She shook her head. He went back to hammering. After a moment, she spoke. "Can I help?" Gideon paused, looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know." He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a pile of boards. "Hand me that plank, the long ones." She walked over, picked it up, and carried it to him. He took it, positioned it against the post, and nailed it in place. They worked like that for a while, silent, steady, the rhythm of hammer and nails filling the space between them. When the sun started to dip below the hills, Gideon wiped the sweat from his forehead and stepped back to inspect the fence. "Good enough," he said. Clara looked at the work they'd done, then at him. "Why are you being nice to me?" Gideon set the hammer down. "Because you deserve it. I don't even know who I am anymore. You're Clara, that's enough." She looked away, her jaw tight. "I used to have a doll," she said quietly. "My mother made it for me. I took it everywhere." Gideon nodded. "When the house burned, I left it inside. I didn't even think about it. I just ran." Her voice cracked. "Sometimes I dream about it, burning." Gideon didn't know what to say, so he just stood there, close enough that she wasn't alone. After a long moment, Clara spoke again. "Do you think they're watching, my parents?" "I think so." "Do you think they're angry that I survived and they didn't?" "No," Gideon said firmly, "they're proud." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "How do you know?" "Because if I had a daughter like you, I would be." She looked at him, and for the first time since he'd found her, she smiled. Just a little, just enough. "If you're still with me, take a breath, pour yourself something warm, and ask yourself this: if you were Gideon, would you have stopped 8 years ago, or would you have ridden past, just like he did? Sometimes the hardest thing isn't facing danger. T's facing the guilt of what we didn't do. Tap subscribe so you don't miss how this story ends. That night, Gideon made supper, beans and cornbread, nothing fancy. They ate together at the small table in the kitchen, the lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. Clara ate slowly, carefully, like she was still getting used to the idea of having food. "This is good," she said. "It's just beans." "Still good." Gideon smiled. After they finished, Clara helped him wash the dishes. They didn't talk much, but the silence felt different now, less heavy, less sharp. When they were done, Gideon walked outside to check on the horses. Clara followed him. They stood together at the edge of the corral, watching Ash, and the mule graze under the stars. Gideon, Clara said. Yes. I'm glad you stopped this time. Gideon's chest tightened. Me too. She leaned against the fence, her gaze distant. I don't know what happens next, she said. I don't know where I go from here. You don't have to go anywhere. She looked at him. You mean that? Yeah. Clara turned back to the stars, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, she said, okay. Gideon nodded. They stood there together, the night stretching out around them, the wind moving through the cottonwoods. And for the first time in 8 years, Gideon felt like maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right. 2 weeks passed. Sheriff Dalton didn't come back. Word spread through the county that he'd left town. Some said he'd been run off. Others said he just decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Either way, he was gone. Clara stayed. She helped Gideon with the ranch work, mending fences, feeding the horses, planting seeds in the small garden behind the house. She didn't talk much at first, but little by little, she started to open up. She told him about the years after the fire, the people who'd taken her in, then sold her, the towns she'd passed through, the things she'd seen. Gideon listened. He didn't interrupt, he just let her speak. And when she was done, he told her about the war, about the things he'd done, the people he hadn't saved. They didn't forgive each other. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be given or taken. It was something that had to grow slowly over time. But they started to heal. One afternoon, Gideon rode into town to buy supplies. When he came back, he found Clara sitting on the porch, holding something in her hands. He dismounted, walked up the steps. What's that? She held it up, a small wooden figure, a horse, carved from a scrap of wood. I made it, she said, from one of the fence posts. I remembered my father used to carve things. I thought maybe I could too. Gideon took the figure, turned it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was rough, but it was clear she'd put care into it. It's good, he said. Clara smiled. Really? Really? She took it back, held it close. I want to make more, she said. I want to remember. Gideon nodded. Then you will. A month later, a group of riders came to the ranch, but this time they weren't there to cause trouble. Hank and a few of the other ranch hands had brought supplies, tools, seeds, even a new saddle for Ash. They'd heard Clara was staying, and they wanted to help. Figure if she's gonna be part of this valley, Hank said, we ought to treat her like one of ours. Gideon shook his hand. Thanks, Hank. The men stayed for supper. They ate together at the long table Gideon had built, sharing stories and laughter. Clara sat beside Gideon, quiet but smiling. When the men left, Hank pulled Gideon aside. You did a good thing, he said. I should have done it sooner. Maybe, but you did it now. That counts. Gideon nodded. Hank tipped his hat and rode off. As the weeks turned into months, Clara grew stronger. She learned to ride, to rope, to work the land. She carved more figures, horses, birds, even a small house. She kept them on a shelf in her room, a quiet reminder of where she'd come from. Gideon built 2 small wooden crosses near the fence line at the edge of the property. He carved names into them by hand, Clara's parents. She'd asked him to, said she wanted a place to remember them. On the day he finished, they stood together in front of the crosses, the wind moving through the grass. Do you think they know? Clara asked. I think they do. She reached out, touched the wood. Thank you, she whispered. Gideon didn't respond. He just stood beside her, the weight in his chest a little lighter than before. Years later, people in the valley would tell the story of the rancher who'd bought a girl from an auction and given her a home. Some said he'd done it out of guilt. Others said he'd done it out of kindness. Clara never cared what they said. She stayed on the ranch, working beside Gideon, learning the land, building a life. She never forgot where she'd come from, but she stopped letting it define where she was going. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, she sat on the porch and looked out at the valley. Gideon joined her, leaning against the post. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "No, this is home." Gideon smiled. They stood there together, watching the light fade, the stars beginning to emerge. And somewhere in the distance, the wind carried the scent of sage and the sound of cottonwood leaves rustling. Clara looked up at Gideon, and for the first time since they met, her eyes held no fear, only peace. "I'm glad you stopped this time," she said. "Me too." The night settled around them, quiet and still. And in that moment, Gideon Cross finally forgave himself.